Choices in Internet Radio, and the staff and host of LA Talk Live would like to thank you for choosing the Internet's hottest destination for the most eclectic sound and invigorating talk. This is LA Talk Live. We are more than just talk.
Welcome to LA Progressive Live, where we delve deep into progressive politics and issues of social justice. I'm your host, Sharon Kyle, and I have with me my co-host and husband, Dick Price. Today we have a very interesting guest and some provocative talk, as always. But also, today is the 59th anniversary of the day that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery, Alabama. It was December 1st, 1955, and she was seated in the area, the colored section of the bus. And as the bus went on its regular route, the front part of the bus, the whites-only part of the bus, began to fill up. The bus driver, James F. Blake, moved toward the colored section. He picked up the sign, and he changed the definition of what the colored section would be, moving the sign directly behind Ms. Parks, and then telling 4 black people to get up and move further to the back of the bus. Now, the myth goes that Ms. Parks was tired. She was a seamstress, she'd worked all day, and she didn't want to give up her seat because she was tired. But the truth is, and she later tells the story, that in fact she was tired of losing her dignity. So on that day, that fateful day, Ms. Parks refused to give up her seat, and today we have fully integrated buses in Montgomery, Alabama, as rest of the rest of the United States. However, many people don't know that there was another woman, a very young woman, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin, who 9 months before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, Claudette Colvin also refused to give up her seat as well. And we'd like to honor and thank Claudette Colvin, who very infrequently is honored for the work that she has done. And by the way, she is still alive. She lives in the Bronx, New York. She is 75 years old. And there was a book written about Ms. Colvin's life. So thank you, Ms. Rosa Parks, and thank you to Claudette Colvin. Now we're going to move on to our guest for today. Dick, why don't you tell us?
So this is quite an auspicious show here. Last week we had our friend Kwasi Nkrumah here just hours before the decision was announced in Missouri not to indict the police officer who had killed Michael Brown. Hours later, Ferguson, Missouri, and really across the country erupted in protest. And here, 1 week later, we're going to address the topic of where do we go after Ferguson, after the no indict announcement, after all the protests. And with us, we have our friend Peter Laarman, Reverend Peter Laarman, whom we've worked with for several years now on a project called Justice Not Jails. Peter was the driving force behind Justice Not Jails, now is the volunteer project coordinator for the project. Until the end of last year, he was the executive director of Progressive Christians Uniting, a network of activist individuals and congregations headquartered in Los Angeles. He served as the senior minister of New York's Judson Memorial Church from 1994 to 2004, ordained in the United Church of Christ. Peter spent 15 years as a labor movement strategist and communication specialist prior to training for the ministry. And over the weekend, you wrote a piece about, the title is Putting a Price on Black Life, Civil Settlements in Bias Cases Rub Salt in Ancient Wounds. Basically saying that, well, why don't you tell us, what was the point of that article?
It was taken actually from an offhand comment made by Attorney Benjamin Crump, representing the Brown family, who was asked in an interview about the move toward a civil suit. And he said, yes, we'll get to that, but that is not what we mean by justice here. What we mean is holding people accountable who take life and holding the system accountable. That's the kind of justice we mean. That prompted me to do a Google search of civil settlements in racial bias cases involving law enforcement, and the numbers just pop out at you. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars are spent by cities and other municipalities, counties in the United States, kind of as blood money. I mean, it's kind of a form of blood money. It's okay. So you're going to get some money. So you didn't win a criminal case because we never convict, but here's some money. And I describe that as salt in an ancient wound, because again, the people taking this money know perfectly well that if their skin color was different, chances are they would have both a criminal conviction and a financial settlement.
Right. So this is kind of a template for how these incidences or these tragedies are handled around the country, and probably the 12-year-old boy in Cleveland who was shot within seconds of the police officers driving up on a child with a toy gun. Probably the family will get some money. The officers won't face any punishment, and there won't be any real sense of change.
No, there won't. I mean, I don't know Kendrick McDade's family up in Pasadena, but they got some money ultimately from the city of Pasadena. After the city of Pasadena, defended the content of the police department to the bitter end, right? Then comes the money. I think if we had McDade's loved ones with us here, they would say they don't feel that their issue was resolved.
But
money is the least of the things that people want here. They want to be acknowledged as human beings, as full equals. When harm is done to them, they have the same recourse legally in the criminal system as any other person.
So what you're speaking of, these events, these remedies, if you will, they remind me of a term that I recently learned, which is a term that Derek Bell, who passed away years ago, but the famous theorist on critical race theory, he coined a term called contradiction closing case. And it was a term that was unfamiliar to me, but I thought, wow, I want to share this term and its meaning. And what a contradiction closing case is, it's when a civil rights victory or some other event around civil rights occurs, and we make it appear as though society is making a major leap forward by doing something right. And so something is done right, like there is some kind of remedy through the courts, through the civil court system, or like in the case of Brown v. Board of Education. We have a society where the lives that are lived by black people is so vastly different than the stories that this country talks, that this country tells, that there has to be some method of letting off the steam, because it just becomes unbearable. And so this contradiction closing case makes it appear as if something major has been done, and then there's a brief shift and maybe even some policy changes. But what happens is that the policies themselves aren't forcefully implemented, and in fact, there's no change at all, like in the case of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. If you look at the school systems today, the public schools in the United States are more segregated today than they were in 1954. So these contradiction closing cases really don't do anything to resolve issues, and in fact, sometimes because of backlash, they make things worse.
Well, they make things worse by reinforcing the perception among a majority of white people that these matters are settled and resolved. I mean, we have a black president, we have a black attorney general, we have black members of Congress. There's no de jure segregation any longer. So what's the beef, right? And that's what we've experienced for this past week. We've experienced people of color talking themselves blue in the face, so to speak, and not being heard by the vast majority of white people who don't want to be in this conversation, because they've been reassured by all those gestures, right? Those contradictory signals that things are on the upward track. You didn't say that the wealth divide between black households and white households is about as bad as it was 50 years ago as well.
That's right. That's true. So, Dick, you and I also had a conversation about white America and the appearance, because of these events, because of these major civil rights victories, that white America tends to believe that everything is okay. And it's not until we have some major upheaval, like what's happening in Ferguson, or the 1992 civil unrest in Los Angeles, or the 1960 civil unrest in Watts, that white America, or the dominant culture, is even brought up to speed, that there are people that are not happy.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I've spent at least a part of my life in a lovely all-white community down the coast from here, where if you were black in town, your name was Shaquille O'Neal. And to that society, it appears that these are mountain ranges, like Ferguson boils up, Trayvon Martin boils up, Rodney King. But in between, you can, if you're not directly impacted by it, you can believe that everything is solved, where the truth is, in the black and brown communities that are deeply affected by this, the awareness is always there. Mm-hmm. It's just one thing is just 3 steps too far, and now it's time to take to the streets.
Right. That's the most infuriating thing, and the most, how to put it, mournful thing now that people feel. 150 years ago, a very wise person said, a person of color said, our countrymen, our white countrymen, do not know us. The cruel hand of fate has been laid upon us because our situation is not understood at all.
So I had a follow-up from earlier talk. So we know that police officers, grand juries, very rarely indict police officers, and we know that district attorneys rely deeply on the police officers to do their jobs. So how are we ever going to have a solution to the fact that police officers around the country on a fairly regular basis are shooting unarmed black and brown men for no very good reason? How are we going to not just go from hilltop to hilltop, but actually find some kind of solution?
I think each police department needs a huge amount of community pressure, unrelenting community pressure, in 2 respects. There's a lot of conversation about cameras, about every incident being recorded and the things never being turned off. We know that actually changes the behavior of law enforcement. We know this from experience now. But in addition to that, the various immunities that law enforcement officers enjoy really need to be looked at very closely. If you are involved professionally in law enforcement, the uniformed service, you have a very different set of immunities and legal entitlements than any other person using a firearm has. And, it's understood how that came about, but that can be changed. And frankly, it's not in the best interests of the police themselves to be a class apart, a kind of, centurion class in a society like ours. It's not helpful for them to have that. There are people in law enforcement who are willing to have this conversation, not enough.
Yeah, I'd raised this in an earlier show that in many of these instances, it seems like the police officers involved are deathly afraid of the people they're policing, particularly in black communities. They're afraid of black men. They're afraid of black communities. They shot that young boy. I mean, that's a very dramatic piece of very short video. They shot him before they even got out of the car because they were terrified of him, number one. And 2, I don't think they valued him as a person, that young boy or Michael Brown or so forth. So I hear that training is important. I think you also see in these shootings that there's a fair amount of incompetence. There's a lack of cultural awareness.
Can I jump in on that fear thing?
Go.
And just tell a personal story. Many years ago, I was fixing up my house. This was before you and I were married, and I was married to somebody else, and we purchased a little dump truck, a little truck broken down. I think we got it for like $200. So it was just, and the only reason we purchased it was because we wanted to haul around landscaping materials. So we didn't really want anything fancy. We just bought a house, we were landscaping. But anyway, in any event, the cars that we used to get to and from work, both cars, for whatever reason, broke down on the same weekend. So the only thing that we had available to us was this little broken down truck. And so my husband wakes me up early in the morning when he discovered that his car wouldn't turn on. He says, "You're going to have to drive me to work, and you're going to have to drive that little broken down truck." So I get up, I have my big hair, I put his hat on, I put on his jacket, and I jump in the truck. I drop him off from work. Now, we had just gotten this truck. It was not registered. The brake lights were broken. The brakes weren't working. Everything that could possibly be wrong with this vehicle was wrong with it. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, I drop him off, and as I'm returning home as quickly as possible, because I'm driving an illegal vehicle, as I'm going home, I almost hit a pedestrian who's crossing the street. So I veer to avoid hitting this person, and then I look in my rearview mirror, and I see that the police had they were behind me, and they had their lights, so I pull over. I look at my side view mirror, and I notice that the officer, as he is getting out of his car, he's taking his gun out. And I'd never seen that before. And immediately I knew, he thinks I'm a black man. I had on my husband's jacket. I had on my husband's hat. My skin clearly is black. And as he approached the vehicle, I rolled down the window quickly, and I said, "I'm sorry, officer. I know that I almost hit that person." And as soon as he heard my voice, obviously he knew I was a woman. But you could see the change in this man's demeanor. Everything about him. He was tense. He had his hand on his gun. As soon as he heard my voice, he relaxed. His body language changed. And he was relieved. And he comes to me and he says, "Ma'am, you need to be more careful. What happened back there?" And I explained to him that this was a car that we had just gotten, and blah, yada, yada, yada. He says, "Well, let me have your license." Well, guess what? I didn't even bring my purse. I had no driver's license, no registration, no evidence of insurance. I had nothing. And I'm thinking, oh boy, I'm in trouble now. Do you know what he says to me? He says, "Okay, just go back home and just try to be careful." And that was it. And I thought, a second before that, he had his hand on his gun, and now I don't even get a ticket. So there's something about this fear.
Right.
And I've been black all of my life. I've never been afraid of black people. I hear that white people are. What's been your experience, either of you?
Well, this archetype of the out-of-control black male is of rich antiquity in our culture, and I think it reflects. I think the fear comes from the guilt. That is to say, the things that have been done to black men make it completely understandable to white men why black men would actually, possibly wish them harm. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I
so
do.
it's that cycling of guilt into fear, even terror.
So I think I've told you the story many times. I think part of what goes into making me who I am is starting at about the age of 9. My best friend until I graduated from high school was the young man across the street, the boy. He was a year older than me, named John, and he was black. And he was my idol. He was a champion weightlifter, skipped a grade in school. We played 1 million hours of basketball. And I think that affected me. That and my dad's example. My dad, he was a teacher, so he needed 3 jobs, and one of them was he was a reserve officer, and I saw him socialize with other black friend officers, and that had an effect on me. And then when I went to New York at 17, Columbia next to Harlem, in Harlem, I think I was less touched by that, and I'm glad for it. And then I would say that, in the Army and so forth, I have not shied away from places where I would be put in a diverse group of people. And I think that's important. I think that's actually the long-term solution to these problems that we're seeing. It may be for another one of our segments, but I had thought that really even the shootings of black and brown men are a symptom of a deeper problem.
Right.
Of course they are.
Yeah.
So what about, the most segregated hour in America? Sitting here as a reverend, what do we do about that?
Well, people have attempted to build from scratch, so to speak, interracial congregations, and there are a few of them in the country. But religion doesn't get off easy in my book in respect to this whole narrative and the whole system of racial oppression. Religion in our country's experience is a validator of separation. It's a warrant for oppression in the minds of many people. people can read the Bible in different ways, and for hundreds of years during slavery time, the preachers in the American South, would routinely cite the verses, slaves obey your masters, and the curse of Ham, all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of toxicity in religion itself. I frankly think that the segregated Sunday morning is still a kind of offshoot of that. It's a kind of a religion as tribalism,
Yes.
In a way.
Yes.
Plus, I've been, of course, sampling what was preached yesterday around the country in churches, and most of it was about as anodyne and toothless as you can imagine. It's all about understanding, compassion. And most of these preachers said, and of course we have to respect law enforcement. We have law enforcement people here in our in our flock. Very few preachers, white preachers, stuck their necks out. There's this kind of the mode that I call like personal confessional. I'm mortified. This is terrible. That gets you absolutely nowhere. White guilt gets people absolutely nowhere. It's just ask Jesus. It's what you do, not what you say, not what you feel. It's what you do that brings you closer to God's kingdom. It's not having guilty feelings or emoting, freely about the racial divide.
Yeah. There's a professor at Brown University. Her name is Dr. Tricia Rose, and she heads up the African American Studies. That may not be the actual name of the department, but that's kind of what the department's about. And she talks about her when she initially became a professor. She was so excited about being a professor, and she'd have these classes, and she'd just almost do a data dump of all the wrongs that had been done to African Americans. And she found that she was having a very hard time getting the mostly white students, because we're talking about Brown University, mostly white students, to be fully engaged. And what she found, a student came to her office and talked about the guilt. So she came up with a pledge. And in her pledge, she has the students to repeat after her or read the pledge. And the pledge pretty much says, I understand that there is racism, sexism, ableism, and all of the other terrible isms that exist in this country, but I didn't have a hand in creating those things. But I also acknowledge that I do benefit in some ways because they existed. And so I'm making a pledge to, from this day forward, to do what I can to make things better. And I think that if we could start from that place where there's an open acknowledgement that, yes, all of these things existed. They exist when I was born. I didn't create racism. I had nothing like you. You had nothing to do with slavery, nor did I. However, I continue to suffer the negative consequences of the legacies that came from slavery. And I talk about that in an article that I wrote this week in LA Progressive, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later.
Well, I actually brought a prop because what people generally don't understand, because people don't know their history, is the extent to which the uncompensated labor of black people built the what we now consider to be the elite institutions, not just the Ivy League institutions, but the University of North Carolina, obviously the University of Virginia. These things that are now thought to be floating above, the racial turmoil down in the streets, and they've managed to cleanse their own history. But fascinating to me that most of the elite educators from the 1810s to the 1830s were all involved in African colonization. Let's get rid of them, right? It's just, it was a big mistake, but of course they can't live with us here in the North, so we just need to ship them to Monrovia, right? Literally the leaders of Harvard, Dartmouth, go down the list, were all involved in this project. Here's the book, Ebony and Ivy. But this is deeper than people want to acknowledge, and people even resist the most basic historical knowledge about the open wound of racism. By the way, black people too. Black people resist it too because it's too painful, and it would be better just to kind of elide it if possible, and move forward.
I think you're right. You know, my grandmother was born into. I hear the music, so that means we have to wrap it up. We're going to be taking a quick little break. This is LA Progressive Live. We're brought to you on latalklive.com. Stay with us. We'll be back in about a minute.
You don't need no baggage. You just get on board. All you need is faith to hear the dealers humming. Don't need no ticket. You just thank the Lord. So people get ready for the train to Jordan, picking up passengers coast to coast. Faith is the key. Open the doors and board 'em. There's hope for all among those loved the most.
Thank you for tuning in to LA Talk Live, reality radio handcrafted for your listening pleasure. This is LA Talk Live, and we're more than just talk. Stay tuned.
It started out like a totally normal day.
I love you.
I mean, I guess I was a little sweaty and I was definitely sore. I thought I had gas. Turns out I was having a heart attack. Heart disease is the #1 killer of American women. So now I take care of myself and tell the other women in my life to do the same. Make it your mission to save your life and the lives of the women you love. Find out more from the American Heart Association at goredforwomen.org.
Hi, this is Dr. Levi, your fitness doctor, making a personal house call, inviting you to join me Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific for my all-new show, The Dr. Levi Show. Join us as we discuss fitness, health, and well-being, including emotional and spiritual health. So don't forget to tune in to The Dr. Levi Show every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, exclusively on latalklive.com and the Talk Live Broadcast Network. You can also catch us on iTunes, Radio R&B, or watch us on Ustream.tv, or catch us on the Live 365 network, and now on Radio Flag and Stitcher Radio. Reality radio handcrafted for your listening pleasure. This is LA Talk Live, and we are more than just talk.
It's the Black and White New Year's Eve dinner and show starring Shantae Moore, the Daz Band, with special guests the Young Hearts. Wednesday, December 31st, New Year's Eve at the Proud Bird Restaurant, 11022 Aviation Boulevard near LAX in Los Angeles. It's a special midnight countdown as the Daz Band featuring Jerry Bell let it whip. Live in concert, the incomparable Shantae Moore with special guest the Young Hearts. Let's ring out the old and ring in the new. It's a fabulous VIP dinner at 6 p.m. and showtime to follow. Tickets available online at ticketleap.com. That's ticketleap.com. Tickets also available at inglewoodtickets.com or by calling 310-671-6400.
Welcome back to LA Progressive Live, where we delve deep into progressive politics and issues of social judgment. This is your host, Dick Price. My co-host and wife, Sharon Kyle, is here on my left. We're streaming to you live from the studios of laprogressivelive.com, and in studio joining us is our friend, Reverend Peter Laarman. So, sweetheart, you also wrote an article this weekend titled 400 Years Slavery to Ferguson. detailing how the legacy of slavery has continued through all these centuries, and even blossoms here in the travails of Ferguson. Would you like to talk about that a bit?
Right. Oh, but first I'd like to say that Peter just gave me this book, Ebony and Ivy, and I'm so excited. I kind of want to just stop the show and just sit down and start reading, because Craig Stephen Wilder just did a fabulous job with that book. I followed him a lot as he was on book tour. Okay, so the article that I wrote, I think I wrote it yesterday, or it was posted yesterday on laprogressive.com, and the name of the article is 400 years, and I think I should have called it 400 Years a Slave. So what happened was, you and I had just started dating, and we were in some kind of conversation, and I mentioned something about 400 years of slavery, and you quickly corrected me and said that no, we didn't have 400 years of slavery. And then I changed what I was saying, and what I meant was 400 years of slavery and oppression. But then, as a result of you correcting me, I really felt the need to get more specific, to educate myself. And so over the years, although I'm not a historian, I am a person that reads a lot, which I'm almost tempted to start reading right now, Ebony and Ivory. But I started doing lots of research about what the legacy of slavery. So we all know that slavery began in the United States during the colonial period. 1619, there were 20 black Africans that were brought over and became enslaved. And it started out as indentured servitude for all people that really couldn't pay their own way, whether you were coming from Europe or whether you were coming from Africa. Indentured servitude was a way to pay the cost of your voyage. But in time, the powers that be found that it was a very effective way. Of course, they tried to enslave Indians first, but then they enslaved blacks. I'm going to make this really short. What I found as I was doing my research is that we actually went from slavery to what's called the Black Codes. Now, these Black Codes essentially were identical to slavery. There are some historians that say if you take a look at the Black Codes, you take the word Negro out of the Black Codes and replace it with the word slave, and basically you got the same thing. So the people did not have freedom to come and go as they pleased. They were forced into involuntary servitude. They were beaten. Same thing with slavery. Black Codes was pretty much the same thing. That the Black Codes stopped around 1866, and then we shifted into a period of time from 1865 to 1944, which is called the convict leasing period. And during this period, which is kind of akin to what we see happening with mass incarceration today with the prison industrial complex, during this convict leasing period, laws that violations that were not punishable by prison time suddenly became punishable by prison time, but it was very selective. So these vagrancy laws, if you were unemployed or homeless, you were subject to being arrested and imprisoned, and then placed into a situation where you were forced to work for the economic benefit of someone else. You didn't earn anything, but you had to work, and if you didn't, you were beaten, and you couldn't leave. So it's the same three conditions. You can't leave, you must have involuntary servitude, and you give up your economic benefit to someone else. We went from, and that the convict leasing actually was abolished in the United States in 1944, just around World War II. It's amazing. And these aren't just one-offs. There are hundreds of thousands of people who were subjected to this. Went from convict leasing to sharecropping. And sharecropping also was kind of ended in the 1950s. And then there was this thing that is considered worse than slavery, which is called peonage. And I had no knowledge of peonage. A wonderful historian by the name of Douglas Blackman wrote a book called Slavery by Another Name. And peonage is where you have involuntary servitude, or sort of neo-slavery, was widely practiced in the South from 1880s to the 1940s. It is illegal, but the perpetrators were never prosecuted. And again, we had large numbers of blacks in the South being held against their will, forced to work without paying any wages, and then beaten. So this has gone on. I had about 10 points in my article, and if anyone wishes to read it, it's at laprogressive.com. Peter, we were talking about this, and you said that there was one major contemporary thing that I had neglected to include.
Well, the near annihilation of whatever accumulated wealth Black America had in the what's euphemistically referred to as the mortgage crisis. People don't know this, but Wells Fargo, for example, does a lot of advertising now and sort of charity work in the Black community. Well, they should, because they were the worst offenders. They had special shops in areas where they thought they could hustle mortgages to Black people, and they peddled them, at an outrageous rate. But not just they. Countrywide did the same thing. They targeted Black people. And then, Black people had a far disproportionate injury when the market collapsed and have not recovered.
Yeah, so these predatory lenders, the same thing exists right now, not just in 2008 but right now these payday lenders, they target poor communities, which because of the intersection of poverty and race, these generally are communities of color.
Right.
These payday lenders.
And
So-
you could say as well that the dramatic disinvestment in public higher education is a blow against people of color, making it much more difficult for people of color to complete their college training within 4 years. And there are all kinds of statistics about that I won't bore people with.
And there's even predatory lending associated
With that,
with
yeah,
educational
that's right, of
institutions,
course,
these
right,
trade schools.
That's
and
right.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't only affect Black people, but you and I are roughly the same age, and I went to an Ivy League college for a while too, and I know you did. Back in the day when my GI Bill and a little half-assed job paid the freight.
That's right.
Now my daughter goes to a public institution and pays a huge amount of money, and who that impacts. And I talk to her friends, and that's a big concern for them, and they don't go forward because of that. And who gets cut out of that? Well, two things get cut out of that. All working class kids, they're much less likely to go to college, and I think democracy in America is hurt. I mean, they talk about the great generation of my dad's generation, where he and his whole family went to college after being dirt poor in southern Minnesota, and so you had that infusion of common everyday folks into high-level jobs, which I don't think we're going to see much of going forward.
That's over. We have kind of rigid stratification now. But I want to be careful, because often one hears people say, well, so isn't the problem really class and not race? In fact, the way class and race are linked in our culture is a particular problem. That's why Michelle Alexander, I think, correctly used the word caste. What we have here is a caste system where to be Black becomes, for most people, a marker of class, right? But it's a different experience if you're Black, right, and struggling than it is if you're white and struggling.
Yeah.
Because white people still get breaks.
Right. Before we took the break, you talked about how people don't like to talk about these things, even Black people. And I started to say before the music started that my grandmother, who was born in 1909, she died just a couple of months shy of her 100th birthday, which was in 2009. So I spent a great deal of my life, more than 50 years, around my grandmother. But she never talked about, and she was born in Durham, North Carolina in 1909. She never really talked about what went on back then, what she saw with her own eyes. And as I did my research, and I've really been deeply immersed in these books and research, and even doing a lot of ancestral research, I found that there's no way that my grandmother did not see some horrors.
Right.
But as you say, we don't share this, even in the Black community. And the reason that we don't share it, I think it's for a different reason. I think it's somehow viewed as a shameful thing.
It is. It is. And that is one of the deepest, saddest, most painful aspects of this. I mean, that's how this kind of oppression works. People internalize the values of the dominant society. The oppressed internalize, the framing of the oppressor, right? And it goes deep, 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 deep.
Yeah.
The pain is unspeakable, but people do not talk about it because what we're talking about is trauma, right? And most people find it very difficult to just chat about a deeply traumatic experience.
That's right.
So we've wanted to focus a bit on solutions, and we did mention for police it would be good if they wore cameras on Justice Not Jails. We're working toward police oversight and so forth, and but that is the fact that all these young black and brown men are being shot is still a symptom of a deeper underlying problem, which I think is our communities don't know each other. We have managed to, particularly here in Southern California, to self-segregate ourselves, both in the workplace, but especially in our communities. I mean, we're spread out. We Sharon and I, as you do, spend a lot of time in activist circles, in progressive activist circles, and they're as segregated as any church could ever be, especially if we go to the website. Or the West Side, we're very welcome because then we have one black person there, but I think it kind of goes back to my boyhood past. I think the long-term solution is us. I'm an old-fashioned integrationist. Us living together, working together, knowing each other day in, day out, not just in the workplace, but in our communities and in our churches. That's the only way police officers are going to roll up on a situation and see their kin there, not some alien that they're afraid of.
Right. But there's more that I think we just have to do. I mean, I think that right now in the wake of what people are feeling and seeing,
right,
there's a real place for sustained, disciplined, nonviolent, direct action. There's a waiting for white people to befriend black people in a society that is in every way, geographically and every other way, as segregated and stratified as ours is really, really a long, long wait. And so how do people who are not ready to take it anymore, white, black, and brown, how do people take the kind of action that demands more than a sort of, White House Day focus on race, for example, today, right? Or more than a, talk of let's have another Kerner Commission. I don't want another Kerner Commission. I want substantive change, structural substantive change. And that's only going to come through relentless protest. I mean,
I certainly don't disagree with you. I do entirely disagree. But as we were preparing for the show, I was trying to imagine a world where there was a real solution, and that's kind of where I was describing it. I think I'm not actually all that optimistic it'll ever happen, but I think until then, we're going to have different kinds of problems arise. And I agree. We have to find an effective way to put an end to each of these symptoms. They may just be symptoms, but nonetheless people are dying. People are being dispossessed from their homes. People are being denied equal opportunity, and we have to, one at a time, if necessary, confront them.
So, Peter, these sustained actions, I think that probably is what led to the end of the war in Vietnam, was that we had this long period where people just would not stop. There was a long period of sustained action, but yet we still have wars. So, to your point, it's important, but it's not the only thing. In South Africa, there was this period of truth and reconciliation. And I've often thought of, there's a woman who wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Disorder. Her name is Dr. Joy DeGruy. Mm-hmm. And she talks about her first visit to South Africa and how she was dreading it because, and this was post Mandela. Mandela had already served as president and was no longer president. She was dreading it because she expected that, like the United States, the South Africa would have some of the even more residual effects, but she found none. And she attributed the success of the the black population in South Africa moving up and fully taking their rightful place in society, she attributed that to their period of truth and reconciliation. And I'm wondering, would something like that help this country? I'm being told that we have a caller.
Well, so why don't we let Peter answer that question, then we'll go to the caller.
Very quickly, the different dynamic in Southern Africa is the people in the black South Africans, the vast majority, accepted and permitted the white people to re-engage. You see what I mean? So the ratio is so dramatically different. Right? And so truth and reconciliation here would be falsification and fake reconciliation, I fear.
Yeah.
So our program director, Richard Carr, tells us we have somebody on the line.
Oh, they hung up.
They hung up. Oh.
They couldn't get a word in edgewise.
Oh, well. Well, please call back if you'd like.
You're always encouraging that. I don't know about that.
Well, so maybe we should take a break, and then we'll go back to our last session and talk about our work together on Justice Not Jails.
That sounds good.
I'm good.
Okay, this is LA Progressive Live. You're listening to us from latalklive.com. We're taking a break. We'll be back in 1 minute.
Just don't let the spin get you down. Things are moving fast. Hold on tight and you will last. Keep yourself.
We know there are many choices in internet radio, and the staff and host of LA Talk Live would like to thank you for choosing the internet's hottest destination for the most eclectic sound and invigorating talk. This is LA Talk Live. We are more than just talk.
Hi, this is Randy Franklin inviting you to join me every Thursday at 5 p.m. for my show, Probable Cause. Join me while I dissect current events, talk about laws, and answer your law enforcement questions. So don't forget to tune in to Probable Cause every Thursday at 5 p.m. exclusively on latalklive.com. You can also catch us on iTunes Radio R&B, TuneIn Radio, Radio Flag, and AHA Radio. Or watch and listen directly at latalklive.com. Reality radio, handcrafted for your listening and viewing pleasure. I am Randy Franklin, and this is LA Talk Live, and we are more than just talk.
Hi, this is Tika Lark Fleming inviting you to join me every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for MP Chronicle Presents The Black Girl Show. Join us as we discuss politics, pop culture, and the other side of Black LA. So don't forget to tune in to MP Chronicle Presents The Black Girl Show every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, exclusively on latalklive.com. You can also catch us on iTunes Radio R&B or watch us on Ustream.tv. Reality radio handcrafted for your listening pleasure. This is LA Talk Live, and we are more than just talk.
If you hear this message, wherever you stand, I'm calling every woman, calling every man. We're the generation, we can't afford to wait. The future started yesterday, and we're already late. We've been looking for a song to sing.
Welcome back to LA Progressive Live. This is your host, Sharon Kyle, and I'm joined in studio with my co-host, Dick Price, and our guest, Peter Laarman. So before we took our break, Dick, what were we talking about?
Yeah, Peter, so as you well know, we spent several years working together on the project Justice Not Jails. Listeners can access our work at justicenojails.org. We publish a weekly newsletter and put up articles there. So how do you think communities of faith can weigh into the problems we've been discussing?
There's a superficial but not unimportant way to weigh in, and that is people who attend religious services and involved religious communities tend to have a fairly high civic capital. They know how to function. They know how to be part of a delegation. They know how to write letters. There's some infrastructure there. So right away within Justice Not Jails, we try to get people actively engaged in the stuff that's going on. As you know, the stakes in our own county here, LA County, are just colossal in relation to the future direction of the sheriff department and the realignment challenge here and this whole jail project, ridiculous $2 billion, actually $3.5 billion jail. So we want people to be on that stuff right now. But then we also want people to really connect the work at a very deep level to their religious values. And that's where we have to actually kind of cleanse the stables of the bad religion gunk I was talking about before, right? And in a way do theological education. Because if we don't do that, it can be a superficial thing. They can be working on mass incarceration issues and then run off to do something else, and there's no real rootedness there. We want to keep them rooted in this narrative of race, stigma, social exclusion, punishment, which is the substratum of the mass incarceration system.
So during the 60s, when I think of the civil rights movement, I think of the church as being core to that, particularly the black church. You mentioned a little earlier, I think we were off camera, the Moral Mondays, and you talked about the leader of that.
Bill Barber, yeah.
Can you talk about what are they doing? And then also talk about realignment. You use the word realignment, but maybe not everyone that's listening knows what realignment is.
How much time do we have? Just kidding. Well, I think there's the stirrings of something that looks a little bit like the civil rights movement, but and Moral Mondays is part of that. But I also think we need to be very careful because, in fact, a majority of church people, including African American church people, were not tremendously enamored of the civil rights movement. It was too disruptive. It touched on that, that whole shame thing that you identified earlier.
Yeah.
So, yes, eventually church people embraced it big time, but there was always some hesitation there. So, what I find now with the Justice Not Jails work is the real activists, the real 24/7 street activists, especially the younger ones, go, yeah, right, the preachers are going to come in and they're going to be a big help. Where have you been all this time? Do we have to explain this stuff to you? Right? There's a great deal of how to put it. Skepticism would be a polite word for people's view of this. So I think I think the faith communities are going to have to. How to put it, earn their stripes, so to speak, in this struggle, and we're a far away from being there. I mean, Michelle Alexander puts it very well. She, in her book, she said, the faith communities, they should be a no-brainer, really, but where have people been, and how will you bring the language and really the wealth of faith traditions to bear in this?
Yeah, so the sense was, at least several years ago when Justice Not Jails got started, that faith communities, in the black community but in all communities, weren't very engaged in mass incarceration. But we were talking before the show that we've seen some stirrings of change. We now have discussion groups around Michelle Alexander's seminal book, The New Jim Crow, about showing how there's as many black men in prison today as there were slaves in 1850, and that book has just caught on like wildfire among activists, and black and white. So I do see some hope in there, and then also the thought, at least my thought, was the idea of Justice Not Jails, and some other organizations like that, was unite not just the faith communities but the activists, to pull them together to make them stronger.
And
That's right. Thank you for mentioning that, Dick, because this is not just an open source thing. Whoever shows up, right? We make a special effort to bring faith people in it, but it's a solidarity across these boundaries. And look, if I didn't think that we could do more with the faith communities, I wouldn't be spending my time in this.
Right.
I was just this week, I'm meeting with leaders of clergy leaders of 3 different faith communities, asking them to kind of step up at a deeper level. I'm speaking actually to the gathering of all the AME ministers about this kind of stuff, and we want to sign them up. And we can't command any congregation to do any particular thing, so we provide a menu of, you could do, here are 8 things, you could do 2 of them, and if you do 2 of them well, reach for 2 more.
So, for those of you, who've never heard of Justice Not Jails, you're not speaking specifically of Christians, right?
No,
This is
no.
interfaith, lay people as well, and what about people who consider themselves atheists? Could they benefit from?
Absolutely welcome. I mean, my own religious tradition is a borderless one anyway. Who knows the mind of God, and who knows who's close to God or not? I mean, I just came from a conference where people who are, professionally involved in religion say they see these days something that looks more like what they understand church to be among the activists in the streets than they necessarily do at the corner of Broad and Main on Sunday at 11 o'clock. And that's the Spirit bloweth where it listeth, says the Bible, right?
So I had asked you to talk a little bit about realignment.
Real quickly,
Yes.
realignment is a huge, potentially promising experiment. It was forced in California by a federal court order to reduce the population of the state prison system, to reduce it quite dramatically. So people who would have been in state custody come back to county custody. These are the non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual offenders. And the real question about realignment is, are we actually going to reduce the overall numbers of people who are caged in California, or are we simply going to change their addresses? And in L.A. County, by far the biggest county in the country, not just in California, we're not doing a good job at all. The resources are staying with law enforcement. We still have far too many incarcerated in our county jail system, biggest local county jail system in the country, right, in the world. And that's the big challenge, to get them to shift resources to community-based rehabilitative services that people desperately need. What a little-known secret about California is that under realignment, people who would have been paroled from state prison had a far better array of integrated services available to them upon their reentry than is now available under realignment. And that's a sort of, that we keep trying to surface that in the public conversation, because people need to understand that the not-for-profit service providers, drug rehab, housing, mental health, and so have been starving in LA County, even though this county has sucked in over $1 billion since realignment began in 2011, over $1 billion in state money.
So would you say that over $1 billion has disproportionately gone to law enforcement?
I wouldn't say that. That's easy to demonstrate. We've got charts that say that 80% has stayed with law enforcement and custody, whereas other counties, San Diego County, for example, another urban county, has put over 50% of the resources into community-based services. So that's the fight. And the newly elected supervisors, plus the returning ones, and the sheriff understand that we're going to fight them on this. We could cut the jail population in LA County, safely cut the jail population fairly quickly by 5,000, and with a better effort at diversion at every level, we could get up to 8,000. At which point, this whole talk of we need a big new jail becomes completely null and void.
Yeah, so friends of mine who've been to prison tell me that 2 out of 3 prisoners are there having something to do with drugs and alcohol.
Drugs, alcohol, and mental illness, dual diagnosed people, yeah.
Right. And my experience, 20 years helping run a halfway house for alcoholics and addicts, tells me that, most of what the crimes that they commit are kinds of things that if they got treatment, they wouldn't be doing it. So I have some hope coming out of Prop 47 that if we fight hard enough, if we actually get that money put into in-community treatment centers, we'll be taking some good steps in the right direction.
We got to do the work. We've got to make Prop 47 fulfill its promise, but I think we will.
So we want to ask our listeners always to do something, and that's what you can do. You can go up on Justice Not Jails. You can go up on LA Progressive. There will be actions there on how to make Prop 47 work.
That's justicenojails.org and laprogressive.com. I'm Sharon Kyle with your co-host Dick Price and our special guest Peter Laarman. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you here next week, same time, same place.
Deep like a fountain is flowing free. And what about me? How can you receive if you're not a Is it blue like the sky? And does it really reach that high? What color is love? Is it near or is it far? Is it distant like a star? What color is love? Does it glow like an ember? And do you remember if love doesn't last? Does it live in the cannot live if a heart isn't giving. When it's over, does it show? Does it leave an afterglow? And I really want to know what color is love.
Thank you for tuning in to LA Talk Live, reality radio handcrafted for your listening pleasure. This is LA Talk Live, and we're more than just talk. Stay tuned.